The following is a conversation with Brian Hoeft, a former director of the Freeway and Arterial System of Transportation, also known as FAST for the Regional Transportation Commission. Brian currently serves as a director at Miovision, a company specializing in transportation management and technology solutions using AI. Throughout his career, Brian has been deeply involved in traffic operations and management. Additionally, he has shared his knowledge by teaching college courses on a range of topics, including intelligent transportation systems, mathematics, science, and critical thinking. Brian has been a featured speaker at numerous conferences and has led workshops worldwide at the Road Transport Authority of Dubai's Traffic Center.
Hello, this is the first episode of the No Limits podcast. Here I have with me Brian Hoeft, who is the first guest of this podcast. He just flew in today in San Francisco. He's from Las Vegas, and so welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much. Actually, the Bay Area is where I grew up, over in Concord.
Oh, nice. How was that? How long were you there for?
It was good growing up. I went from first grade through high school, so about 18 years, and then moved out, went to college, and started my work life, my family life, and ended up in Vegas for the last 30 years.
Wow, last 30 years, that's a long time. And you've probably seen Vegas grow significantly since when you first moved to now. How has that changed?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what hotels are still around that were around when I got there. Back in 1994, the Stratosphere Tower was almost complete. So that's an iconic place in Vegas.
Oh, really? Wow. And now, we have that MSG Sphere.
The Sphere is amazing.
I think it's about to open up too in few weeks in September this month, right?
Right. And we do have tickets to go see U2 in October. So I will be there for a concert in just over a month.
That's the first concert that they're hosting?
Yeah, U2 is doing a residency there, so they will have several concerts throughout the end of the year. And then, of course, the Formula One race is going to lap around it.
Nice. Las Vegas is such a very interesting and unique place. It's growing so fast, as you can see. And, I've actually had the pleasure of working in Las Vegas before I came here to Berkeley and going to school here. But, I had the pleasure, that's where I got to know you for the past 2 years. And you've been a really good friend of mine. And so I'm happy that you're here recording this first podcast episode with me, especially in the ITS space.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and we had a great send-off for you on the top of the Veer Tower right there on the Strip.
Yeah, that was really fun. No, thank you for that. And it was interesting to see from that perspective too, because we were at the very top of the roof. You could essentially see the grid space and all the traffic, especially at night. And could you essentially kind of talk about that? I know that you had your experience working with RTC as the director of FAST previously.
Correct.
Before you're working at Miovision now, where you're also the director over there now. So can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so FAST in Las Vegas actually stands for Freeway and Arterial System of Transportation. So it's a big part of ITS. And what was nice of that view up on the 36th or 40th floor, whatever it was, is you could see the lights of the vehicles, you could see the lights from the signals, you could see the traffic flow and then stop and then flow again. Actually, a related story, when I was director at FAST, I had the opportunity to go up in the helicopter with one of the traffic reporters. Oh. And so then we got a great view of all the ebb and flow. And I used to always talk to him about vehicle platoons.
Yeah. Interesting. What did you see about the vehicle platoons? And for those of you who are familiar with vehicle platoons, it's essentially just a conglomerate of vehicles traversing through the intersection. And ideally, you want the groups or conglomerate of vehicles to go through the corridor smoothly as possible. But oftentimes, as you viewers are aware of and have experienced yourself, is that these get interrupted through red light traffic signals.
Correct. So let's say that you're exiting the freeway at Sahara and you want to travel west towards Summerlin. You make that left turn to travel west, and then ideally we could run you through 7, 8, 10 green lights without having to stop. Now, that does come at kind of a cost, so I can elaborate on that. So it's good for you if you're in a vehicle, but let's say you're a pedestrian trying to cross and you have all these vehicles traveling at 45, 50 miles per hour. Even if the vehicles have to stop, there can be some challenges with the pedestrians, the bicyclists.
And especially, it's even more prominent, especially on the Strip in Las Vegas, where you have a lot of tourists, people who are not paying attention, people who are intoxicated. And so how has your experience been like, working in that realm?
Yeah, the Vegas obviously is very interesting. It's not like, say, a Dallas where on a weekday you go to work, you have a coffee, you have a lunch, you do your work, and you go home. In Vegas, you have a little bit of that, but you have it 24/7, 365, and then you have all these events. I mentioned the Formula One race coming.
Yeah.
We have the Super Bowl coming. We have a lot going on in Vegas, so it's not the normal travel that most other cities have.
Yeah. Now, that's a fun topic. The Formula One race, you just mentioned the MSG sphere. So many different elements that are coming into Vegas, which is a ever-growing fast city. And I know that you've done some recent travels as well, especially in the ITS space. You've got to DC quite a few times. And now you're here doing this podcast episode with me. And so with your experiences and your travels, like, I want to know, and I'm sure the audience would be curious to know, like, what's kind of driven you to doing all that, including doing this podcast?
Yeah, part of it, and we've talked about it in our past conversations, is I do have a lot of experience, and I have a lot of varied experience from the government, from the private sector, from working in Vegas, from working with people in DC, from working internationally, say in Dubai or the Caribbean, not horrible places to go to, but this experience now needs to be shared with these new generations of engineers. And when you run a traffic management center, whether it's in Las Vegas or the Bay Area or wherever, that's when you see the real world of traffic meeting up with ITS. So people can talk about it at the conventions, on their PowerPoints, but until you live that day by day, hour by hour, 24/7, that's when you know what really works. And you also see the challenges that need to be overcome. You also see when something works really, really super well, and that gets exciting too.
And where have you seen those areas where they work super duper well?
Okay, one of my favorites is what we call incident management. So on the freeways, the idea unfortunately, you might have a crash. You might have a little bumper to bumper hit. So it's not something that's serious, but if you're in your car, you were just in that minor crash, what do you typically do? You wait for a emergency vehicle to show up, like a trooper or somebody to show up.
Yeah.
But what's happening in the meantime, if you're waiting there 5, 10, 15 minutes in the middle of the freeway? What's going on?
Exactly. And it's even worst case scenario is that you got into a crash, and so it's most of the time a very traumatic experience for many people, depending on the severity of it. You may not even know where your phone is. And so it's even just contacting, getting the emergency response people to be even aware of the situation. And then from there, once they are contacted, then the minutes that it takes to get to that location. So all those logistics that go into play, that makes it highly inefficient and also dangerous.
Right. So we solved quite a bit of that in Las Vegas. We had a great system where we could see most of the freeways. And the idea was that if we saw a crash or somebody called in, the first thing the dispatchers were going to do is say, can you just drive your vehicle to the shoulder? Don't worry about the insurance. Don't worry about that stuff. You need to get that vehicle out of the middle of the freeway because you're causing crashes, you're causing congestion, but you could be causing what is called a secondary crash.
Yeah. But, I'm sure that many viewers are also, wherever they are in their cities, have experienced the opposite, where they've seen and they experience a lot of congestion, especially during when, an emergency vehicle is called, and there are issues with the connection with these vehicles and the intersection. And so, although we do have cases where they are effective, how can we get to a point where we can ensure that all the intersections operate that efficiently in that manner?
Right. So that gets into digitalization. So there's a lot of hardware infrastructure, but digitally we want to now be able to connect all these different systems, kind of like we're doing in this room with the video and the laptop and the audio, and we're making that all work out. Yeah. But in a traffic signal, you want to connect to the emergency vehicles. You want to connect to the transit. You want to make sure that a pedestrian or a bicyclist can cross that intersection safely.
Yeah. And actually what's interesting is, since we, worked in a similar space in Las Vegas, what I found in my previous work is that some of these systems that you're talking about you are different systems, completely different entities, and they're not necessarily communicating with one another. And that's the difference. Like the pedestrian detection is a completely different system than vehicle camera detection of a vehicle. And so it's about how can we get all these systems connected and communicating with one another.
Right. And one of the things that my company is doing, and I don't want to make this like a sales pitch for Miovision, but one thing that we are doing is we are bringing those systems together digitally through common pieces of hardware. So can we measure what we're doing? Can we have the flow of the traffic be smooth, not just for vehicles, but safe and smooth for pedestrians, bicyclists? Can we have it be smooth for the transit vehicles and the emergency responders if they have to change the lights to green to let the paramedics get through a signalized intersection? And can we evaluate the intersections for how safe they are?
So can we?
We can. We are starting to do that. But to do those very important things, you have to make sure that your signal system can do some fundamental things as well. And a lot of times we see all these important shiny objects that we want to do, but then we look at our signal system and we can't even do the fundamentals very well.
Yeah, the fundamentals, right? Because, I see that we're sitting in traffic, and I'm sure many people that are watching or listening can also relate to this, is like, we're at a time and space now where we have AI, we have ChatGPT, we have these advanced technologies, but yet we can't get our intersections to operate in an intelligent way. And yet the space is called intelligent transportation systems. And so is it really intelligent, and what is intelligent? And that's the frustrating part. Is it all just a hoax that we're just telling ourselves? And I'm sure many people are frustrated with that. Like, what are we doing? We have the technology, we have the capabilities, but what do you think is the key in ensuring that, we make sure that all these technologies and all these systems work together in which it serves the people and the public good?
Right. So you want your signals you want your group of signals for a city to do three basic things. They need to sense or detect travelers, whether they're in their cars or they're pedestrians or they're bicyclists. You need to communicate that information to a control system that can act on that information. So you were saying, I might be at a red light. There's nobody on the cross street in front of me. It's very frustrating. So a couple of things could be happening. The intersection could be sensing that there's no vehicles there, but it can't communicate that information to a control system. So there's no way to act on that information. Or maybe the communication works, but the sensing isn't working.
Yeah. And what you're telling me, that it's supposed to be or should be an easy problem to solve. And is it just because, like, what is the issue with that? And like, how can we solve that?
Right. I think part of it is the understanding how the funding works and having an agency that's full of engineers who maybe aren't very experienced with the funding side of things. Maybe they're having trouble telling their story. Maybe they can't convince the decision makers to give them the money they need. I believe the funding is out there. I believe that somehow the story to get the funding where it needs to go gets mixed up more often than not, and that's why we continue to have this problem. This is a problem that's been around for several years, even decades. Now the technology has become much more capable, but we're still having trouble getting that technology to actually land on the street and do its thing.
Yeah. The funding or the spending money part, it all comes down to human nature, right? To convince people to spend money is a difficult task. I think just in general, not even just in this space. So to say, like, we should spend this money, it takes a convincing. People have to see the evidence and the proof. And unfortunately, what we're seeing a lot, not even in just technology, but in many other realms, is people say, like, oh, we have the technology, we can do this and that, but then there are other steps and mechanisms to ensure that it's success, but then those steps are not in place. And so that's why it's crucial that not only is the technology being deployed correctly and configured correctly, but that there's leadership involved, communication. So could you expand on talking about how we can get to a point of execution, having these technologies deployed, and then getting to a part where we actually see these results?
Yeah, so and a lot of times I'll talk in threes. So I'm going to give you another set of threes to talk about. Engineers, traffic, ITS professionals are very good at talking about the features of their system or the features of their product. They can list off all these things that it can do. I have AI, I have recording, I have high def. I can do all these features. Then they become a little less well at doing the second thing, which is talking about, okay, what are the benefits of these features? How can I quantify that I'm making traffic more efficient? I'm making it more safe. A lot of times they can't get those performance measures and those quantifications that are necessary to tell the story, but that's only two parts. The most important one I haven't even mentioned yet.
Well, even with the quantification part, what I'm also seeing sometimes that some companies will do, or some engineers may do, unfortunately, is, tell a story that they want to portray and not the actual evidence of what is actually happening on the roadway, which is kind of concerning. And so I think it's just taking a level of good communication and making sure that we can not only quantify the data, but quantify the actual data.
Right, and then also speak to it in a way that I'll say a normal person can understand. If you speak engineering too much, people are going to tune out. But here's an example I hear a lot. So, there's all kinds of coffee out there, but why do people tend to go to Starbucks where they're paying a few extra bucks for their coffee? Why would you go to Starbucks, or why would you go to your favorite coffee place that might be a little more expensive? What's triggering them?
I think consistency and familiarity. Familiarity is definitely the biggest one, in my opinion, because people are familiar with a name brand like Starbucks. They feel comfortable. It's like the same thing, like why do we get captured through commercials, and why are there even commercials? It's because they exist because once we see that product, we become familiar with it. And the more familiar we are with something, the more safe or comfortable we feel about purchasing it or having it in our lives.
Right. It triggers some sort of emotion. So that's the third key thing. And engineers triggering emotion about traffic signals, I guess, is a real tough thing to do. So there's the features, there's the benefits, and then there's the emotion. We need to get to that emotion step so that the decision makers, the budget makers will say, oh, we're going to give you millions of dollars to improve your system because you struck that tone with me, you created that emotion, but we're not getting there with our list of features, and then we tend to stall out right there. We're not even getting close to the emotions.
Yeah, the emotions is so and I think it's because engineers naturally, we're known to stay in our cubicles and not really, and be like introverts. And so it's that level of engineering in which you can kind of go outside of that, and the leadership aspect that can really tie two together, in which we can have our technologies work for us.
Right. Do you know how you can tell if an engineer is an extrovert?
How?
Because they look at your shoes when they're talking to you.
That's funny. Yeah, no, so since we're on the subject, talking about you mentioned three components. I think you also mentioned to me at some point outside of this conversation, the four pillars of ITS that is defined in the United States. Could you elaborate on that and define that?
Yeah, so every 5 years or so, the United States government, the Department of Transportation, will release a big funding bill. And we're in the middle of one that's bringing over $1 trillion into the United States infrastructure, which is very sorely needed. So with that money out there, they also want to make sure that we're addressing what are the most important things for the people in charge of transportation right now. What's the most important things for the Biden administration and the U.S. government, because they're the ones in charge. So there's four key pillars.
And what are those for?
Okay, safety first and foremost. Number two is described as economic competitiveness. That's another way of saying let's take care of the traffic congestion, because if everybody's stuck in traffic, you're not going to be economically competitive. But we've kind of spun towards using the word economic competitiveness. So those are the first two. Number three, sustainability, making sure that, understand this, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, everything that's, making the temperatures going up around the planet, transportation accounts for 25 to 30% of all the emissions that is making the planet warmer. So we need to make our transportation system less of a contributor to the greenhouse gas problem. The fourth one that's becoming new but is very, very important, is equity. Making sure that all people, especially kind of the underserved communities, can benefit from transportation. Those people can get to their jobs, they can be kept safe, they can have a nice transit system to use if they don't want to or they can't afford to use a private vehicle. So safety, economics, sustainability, and equity.
Interesting. Now, are all these 4 pillars being talked about in the ITS conferences that you're going to globally, or is it just the United States?
It is a global thing, and some places in the globe, like Europe, they may be a little further ahead when it comes to sustainability. I think everybody is at a pretty good level when it comes to safety. And then what also happens is that when you start to look at different types of money that comes from these bills, if a state or a city wants certain funding, it has to show, I am going to improve safety this way, I'm going to improve equity this way. It has to demonstrate that when it spends the federal money, it's going to spend it to address the goals of the federal government.
Yeah, interesting. And why is it that America or the United States is further behind Europe?
I mean, with sustainability, I think we've just, politically and emotionally, it's just not the way that we're wired. I think we're coming around more and more. I think as we see more and more evidence of, the problems, the destruction, the heat, the severe storms, I think will become more and more recognizable of that. It takes time. People are wired differently.
Yeah, I mean, Europe definitely has their own storms and own, natural issues as well. I think in particular, potentially why the U.S. may be behind is just the way how we naturally built our environment to be very car-centric. Being car-centric as opposed to public transportation, I think that's where Europe and even Japan and Dubai kind of leans in that sustainability realm and getting people from point A to point B much quicker. It's really interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah.
What are some other major issues in our infrastructure that you would like to point out that you're seeing, especially related in the ITS space in Las Vegas predominantly, since that's where you currently live right now?
Yeah, let me actually go to your point there a little bit. So think of the city of Las Vegas. It grew a lot in the last 30 to 40 years, and it grew when people already had their cars, and so the network was built to take care of the cars. It wasn't built to take care of buses and walking and pedestrians. But compare Vegas to a city like Rome in Europe. Rome is built off of the grids from the chariot races and the Roman Colosseum back when people had to walk or maybe take horses around. But that same transportation network is still in place, so it's not a car-centric network. That's why they have always been able to stay with transit. They've been able to stay with walking and pedestrians much more than we do in Las Vegas, where to really get anywhere, you have to get into a car and drive on your street. So it's just that layout of the city's geography that definitely contributes. The newer cities that grew in the 70s, 80s, and 90s are going to be more car-focused than cities that are based on grids from hundreds of, if not thousands of years ago.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's the transition phase of technology. Mm-hmm. It's that awkwardness. How do we get from going from horse carriage to these giant metal vehicles into now in this decade, we're now seeing a new technological era of autonomous vehicle systems, which we're also right now seeing we're in an awkward phase of how do we transition to these robots essentially to operate with humans. And so it definitely is a difficult problem to solve as far as how do we integrate new technology into something in an environment that's already been built, already been established. It's not like we can just tear down the grid network, from physical space and just completely remap. What is feasible?
Right, and you kind of have to do it like we've done in Las Vegas the last 10 years, or like what's happening across the bay in San Francisco. They have that company called Cruise, which has a lot of autonomous taxis. And there are some challenges. There's challenges with the emergency vehicles. There's challenges with sometimes those vehicles just not knowing how to react. I heard stories. I was at a conference in Tampa just a couple of days ago. They said that people will go out and stand directly in front of the cars just because they're being a little bit belligerent to the cars. They'll put a traffic cone on the hood of the car is going to stop. But I think over time, a lot of lessons are going to be learned. People are going to get used to the benefits of autonomy. Autonomy is going to prove to be much, much safer. What's interesting now is that let's say that a driverless car does have a crash with another vehicle, or heaven forbid has a crash with a pedestrian. It can still happen, but every year in the United States, 43,000 people are dying on our roadways, and this is from driverless cars happening. We're going to significantly reduce the number of fatalities and serious injuries with automation. But when we do have those few events right now, especially kind of in this transitionary stage, those are the ones that make the headlines. But the 100 people getting killed each day do not make the headlines, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because that goes into the point of communication, right? And unfortunately, I feel like we are in an age where we are heavily influenced by what we're seeing in the digital space, that being like the media and what the media wants to portray. And unfortunately, what we're seeing in the ITS space is what's being shown to the wider audience of like, oh, well, what's going to make headlines?
Right.
That's really interesting. Oh, this new autonomous vehicle that is like this robot crashed into a person. Like, this is going to make headlines. You know, it's much more, unfortunately, interesting than a traditional, typical, human to human crash that we see every day, or that happens every day.
Yeah.
And that's the unfortunate part, because what does that do? That kind of it scares people with the new technology. But I think over time, time is honestly going to be in our favor as with all technology. And technology, there's an exponential to acceptance of technology these days. I mean, we see that with our cell phones and computers, and I think we're going to see that with vehicles as well. Although vehicles is more scary because we're putting our whole physical body in this giant hunk of metal. You know, it's not like we're just holding on to this piece of metal and we're just because, in that sense, we have that power control to operate. Now, I think, in the public sphere, some of them that are fearful of this technology, it's because we're actually putting our entire body, our entire vessel in a metal vessel, and trusting it with our whole lives. So that makes it interesting.
Yeah, well, we do that. We have that trust in airplanes now.
That's a good point, actually.
And we don't even give it a second thought. So I think, like you said, it takes time. And we're going to learn a lot of lessons from what's happening in San Francisco right now, because there's interaction with the transit agencies. They aren't overly thrilled with this. Fire departments aren't overly thrilled. But the companies backing this deployment of the automated vehicles, they know going in that they are going to have some challenges, but they also have enough resources that they should be able to ride through the challenges. And a couple months from now, we might not be talking about it, and that will be a win, and then it will just become more and more commonplace. And think about other benefits. At some point, we're all going to become too old to drive, but we're still going to need to go to the doctors. We're still going to need to do our shopping or go out for entertainment. And these vehicles can take us there. They can take the people who otherwise wouldn't be able to go.
Yeah, no, exactly. Actually, when you're mentioning the whole shopping and going to see a doctor, even that, the shopping aspect, we're already seeing the automation, like automation taking over with that too. I think essentially we're seeing everything being more automated, and we're kind of integrating our likely in that manner. Yeah,
but still socially, an 80-year-old person, a 90-year-old person, and people are living much longer these days, they still need that physical, that interaction eyeball to eyeball with other people. But if they can't drive, they may be stuck in their home. Automated vehicle could show up, they get in the vehicle, they go have some fun with their friends.
Yeah, no, it can potentially open up new doors, with AI. I mean, we're seeing that with like ChatGPT. There's pros and cons to that, right, with all technology. But like I mentioned before, there's that awkward transition shift. And I think that's kind of the issue and the concerning factor, this space, the autonomous vehicle space, that has many people concerned. I'm not concerned. I'm all about it because I do agree with you that it will save many of our lives, we humans, we make a lot of mistakes.
Right.
And we are easily distracted. I think it's safe to say that majority of people are still, unfortunately, on their phones as they're driving, or will get that dopamine, that notification that sends them the signal that they have a text or a phone call, and they're inclined to want to pick it up or answer as they're driving.
Right.
However, with the autonomous vehicle, they don't have that human tendencies like we do. So in a sense, but yeah, no, it's interesting. And I'm wondering, what sort of, background that you can capture from all these travels that you've gone to, and sort of the frustrations. I know you essentially kind of made a really interesting video that I found very entertaining, and I'll probably play that as well.
Okay, for some clips at least.
Yeah. So the audience can kind of see is really interesting some of the points that you pointed out, and some of the issues that we're seeing with funding in government and tying that into the issues we're seeing in our infrastructure. So could you kind of expand on some of those points?
Right, and I think one thing that traffic engineers have done in the last 15 years or so is to grade themselves on their traffic operations. And it gets back to those fundamentals. A transportation system, especially with traffic signals, needs to sense, it needs to communicate, and it needs to control. And those are the things that don't get enough attention. And back as early as the mid-2000s, the traffic engineers gave themselves a D-, and then a few years later a D, and then a D+. Most recently in 2019, they gave themselves a C+. So I think they recognize what's going on. This also gets to our conversation about how do we tell a story to get the funding to come our way so that our systems can do those three fundamentals a lot better. Because if you can sense, communicate, and act on the information, then you can start to customize it and specialize it to emphasize the safety and emphasize the transit and other folks like that. But telling that money story and getting the money to work is still a big challenge for our profession.
So interesting. So I have two questions then. Okay. So the first is, how are those grades like being evaluated? You mentioned that engineers essentially give grades on the roadways, not even just the roadways, but all the infrastructure. They have categories. And then my second question is, once we have the funding, then like how do we make sure that that funding gets spent well? Because we know the history that sometimes that's not always the case.
Right. So seeing those grades can attract attention, especially with them not being the world's best grade. So I think that can get the attention of the local leadership in a community. It can certainly get the attention of those who advocate for transportation, like an ITE or an AASHTO or an ITS America. It can also, get the attention of the people who put together these funding packages so that they can make it helpful. I think the funding, especially from the federal government, can be very complicated, and it's tough to get it actually into the hands of the people who will make the purchases to set up the traffic signal systems. That complexity, I don't know if it will ever go away, so we just need to know how to navigate it better.
Yeah. Now, is that the work of the engineers, or is it the work of the politicians, or it's the work of both? Because I think that's the challenging part, right? Because engineers are focused on getting the project, doing the work, and satisfying the client. And then, the politicians their job is to make sure that, the things that are in place actually get executed, and working with the engineers and the companies. But how do we get those two agreements for the unanimous effort to work?
Yeah, I think there needs to be an awareness. Somebody needs to be listening, and the right person needs to be listening. You need people who can communicate between the engineers and the funding decision makers. You need to bridge that gap, and I think that gap is very wide and very commonplace. So I think that's something that you, me, and others need to be aware of and actually act on. And we also need to communicate that to the people who create these funding bills, so that, man, if they could just not make it so complicated. But I don't know if that's ever going to go away. But yeah, you need somebody kind of working in that gray area between the engineers and the decision makers.
Really interesting perspective. I definitely see that the work that you're doing is very important. I see that you're going to these travels and conferences and networking, having these important discussions. And so I really am glad that you're here, like having these discussions with me, because I think that that's why we're doing it. We want to share with the world the points of which the issues that we're seeing in our infrastructure, and also in the ITS space, the intelligent transportation system space, in which it's supposed to be intelligent in operation, and sometimes we don't see that. And so how do we get to a point where we can get our systems to work intelligently? So is there any other are there any other points that you feel strongly about that we haven't perhaps touched on?
I think a point just came into mind when you were just making these last statements. So, we're working off of iPhones now. 20 years ago, we would have been with huge cameras and huge microphones and all that stuff hanging over us. But now we can take an iPhone for the most part and create this wonderful podcast. That's all kind of done in the private space. It's all done personally. I'm doing it, you're doing it, everybody else is doing it. When it comes to public infrastructure, everything is out there on the street, and it's hard to go from an old school 1970s dial-up phone to a phone that does pretty much everything for you, and it just can't happen as smoothly. Basically, the old rotary phones have been thrown away or they're in museums. When it comes to public infrastructure, you can't get rid of it that quickly, and it's tough to overlay it with all the digitalization. That's what needs to happen. It's slowly starting to happen, but it's kind of like you're stuck with the old dial-up stuff out on our streets.
That is a really interesting way of looking at it. Because you're right. Like with our phone technologies, we have them like in museums. Like, remember the first iPhone and pagers.
Yes.
We're not using it anymore. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not like we're having to put our physical self inside of it, or if we can hold it into our hands and we can just discard it and get rid of it. But when we're working with something like an infrastructure, we can't just get rid of it. We are in it for like our whole body and environment. Our whole body is in the environment, and so we constantly have to overlay it. But how do we overlay it in an intelligent way is been an issue, because it'd be easier if we could just erase everything and just start off clear and just build our infrastructure like from scratch. But we can't do that. And so what we're seeing, I feel like we're building on top of building on solutions that are perhaps may not be as sustainable from what we're seeing. And so getting to a place where we can overlay in a sophisticated way with technology that serves us. And I think what you mentioned, the 3 aspects, what were they again? It was communication.
Right. The sensing or detecting something, communicating that information, and then having that information acted on. So we sense that there's no vehicle in front of us. So we communicate that to the control system. The control system says, all right, give the street with the traffic the green light, and give the red light to the street where there's no traffic. Those 3 things, once they get up and running, as well as they should be, as well as they can, then we can start to bring in these more technically focused layers of action, like transit and things like that.
And those 3 things should be easy engineering problems to solve, because it's just the sensing part and communicating that to the other system. I think the real key thing with making sure that it works is having an entity making sure that it operates well, because you can have a technology that works, but if it's not being properly maintained or configured, then it does no good.
Right, and sometimes an agency knows how to maintain and configure the older technology, and the newer technology scares them. So sometimes they put up their hands and say, you know what, we're just going to go with what we know. And maybe my vendor isn't even providing parts for my equipment, but I know how to use some duct tape and make it kind of work anyway. We got to get over that. So I would say, Linda, as you work with your generation of engineers, and you work in the academic field, and you communicate with people, make sure they're aware of these challenges, that there are solutions for them, but you're the people who are going to have to implement these solutions. So it's going to be something that has to be overcome, but it can be overcome.
Definitely. I would love to have more of these discussions with my future other guests in the podcast. And in fact, I'm actually going to Cairo where IEEE is sponsoring, me going out there to talk about the ITS space and how can we leverage these technologies and networking professionals over there. Shortly after that, I'll be going to Israel.
Okay.
And, a few townspeople companies are out there, but just kind of investigating and seeing what's out there. I think it's important to have these discussions. I think it's also important to continue having these discussions and an open-ended discussion where there can be disagreements, there can be agreements, but a space where we are actually finally starting to talk about. Because, before podcasting and all that, we just worked day-to-day operations, but now that, technology is moving at a very quick, fast pace, we have to have these discussions. And so thank you so much, Brian, for coming on to this first episode with me and having these amazing discussions.
Thank you, Linda. And I look forward to staying in touch with you, and maybe I'll join you on some of your trips. I may have an Israel visit coming up in just a few weeks. I think we're kind of synced up on our desire and our need to travel.
That's amazing. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here in San Francisco and enjoy the amazing weather that we have here. Since I just transitioned from Las Vegas to San Francisco weather, I actually do not miss the Vegas heat. I've been enjoying the Bay Area weather. It's been quite pleasurable so far.
September and October are very nice months here.
Yeah. I'm going to have to see how the winter is like here. But
Not horrible. Not too bad.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having this amazing discussion with you. And I hope to have you again in this podcast.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much.